Good morning, magandang umaga, a beautiful sunny Wednesday morning to our guest in today's webinar from a distance, doing Philippine communication and media research as a student abroad, organized by the Philippine Association for Communication and Media Research, Incorporated, or PACMRI. I am Randy J. C. Solis, Chair of the Department of Communication Research of the University of the Philippines Diliman College of Mass Communication and Vice President of PACMRI. It is my pleasure to be the facilitator of today's webinar and join our four speakers who have graciously said yes to our invitation despite their busy schedules to talk about their current dissertation or research projects, but also perhaps more personally and practically share their experiences as students and scholars abroad. Just a little ahead of my colleagues who are speaking this morning, I have also recently completed my PhD study in communication from the School of Journalism and Communication at the Chinese University of Hong Kong just last year. So I'd also be happy to join the discussions later and maybe ask incriminating questions to our speakers to put them on the spot and to keep the exchanges more interesting. For their presentations, the speakers were requested to pre-record their presentations to address potential connectivity issues and time management. But please know that our speakers are here with us today. I would like to give some time for our speakers to say a quick hello to everyone before we start. We will also give more details about our speakers later, right before each of their presentations. So just to say some quick highs and hellos, may we first call on Dr. Carlo Depano.
Um, Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar.
Right, we're so excited to hear about your dissertation work, Carlo. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Let's have Mr. Omar Dumdum.
Hello, everyone. Good evening from Madison, Wisconsin. And salamat sa pag-imbita sa akin dito. It's always a pleasure to see all of you guys here.
We're happy to see you again, Omar. Anong oras dyan?
8:30 ng gabi.
It's 9:30 here. 9:30. Yeah. Sige, we're excited to hear about your work also. Let's have Mr. Carl Patrick Mendoza to say hi.
Hello, good morning to everyone. So thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I'm really looking forward to our open forum later.
So Carl is actually in the Philippines, right? In Manila,
yes.
Not in New Zealand. Okay. Thank you, Carl. And lastly, we have Dr. Orville Tacho.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and good evening from Alabama. Thank you for inviting me, Doc Solis, and to PACME and Doc Paragas.
Thank you, Orville. I hope you already had your dinner.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much to our speakers. This webinar actually is the first of a series of webinars that the PACMRI is organizing for the year. Please watch out for the announcements for the succeeding webinars, which we will post on the PACMRI Facebook page. That's facebook.com/PACMRI and through other channels. The PACMRI is also open for memberships, for membership applications from May 1 to June 7, 2021. We will share more information about this towards the end of this webinar. So this morning's webinar seeks to draw out experiences in studying and pursuing research abroad for Filipino communication and media scholars. We will hear about our speakers' dissertation or research projects that may inspire us in our own research endeavors. On top of this, we will also provide a space for our speakers to share their experiences during their application processes, their coursework, etc., and answer related questions from our audience. Our audience, by the way, for this webinar joins us from Facebook. We are now live streaming. We thank you for joining us this morning and hope that you find this experience useful and meaningful. Now, to formally open the webinar, I would like to invite the president of the Philippine Association for Communication and Media Research Incorporated, Dr. Fernando de la Cruz Paragas, to give the opening remarks. I think that the sound is not, we cannot hear Dr. Hernan. Just check maybe if it's on mute or something.
I'm sorry, I can hear it, but I don't know what's happening.
Cannot. Okay,
Let me share it again.
let's try, yes. So while waiting, no, naramdaman nyo ba yung lindol? So I hope that doesn't change how beautiful the day is today. We look at our participants on Facebook right now. We have Dr. Fernando de la Cruz Paragas. We have people commenting, participants coming from Zamboanga City. Good morning to Hey Sierra. From Rodriguez Rizal, good morning. That's Saivor. And then we also have participants from Bulacan. Hi, Nikki Ann, good morning. And who else? Do we see familiar faces? We now have like around 62 viewers to our live stream. So I hope you will ask questions later on. No? Our speakers are ready for your questions.
Let us try again.
Let's try again.
Can you hear it? No.
No, no audio. Let me try something.
Good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the launch of our 2021 webinar series with today's event on doing and studying communication and media as a student abroad. We are joined today by 5 scholars who have earned or about to earn their doctoral degrees abroad. They study a range of topics from interpersonal persuasion, news media actors, vaccine hesitancy,
Is the shared video working? Okay, sige. Let me just share this time. All right, once again, for the opening remarks, let's have Dr. Paragas.
Good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the launch of our 2021 webinar series with today's event on doing and studying communication and media as a student abroad. fellowship from a program such as Fulbright to securing a scholarship from the university itself.
Sorry, let me play that again.
Good morning, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome all of you to the launch of our 2021 webinar series with today's event on doing and studying communication and media as a student abroad. We are joined today by 5 scholars who have earned or about to earn their doctoral degrees abroad. They study a range of topics from interpersonal persuasion, news media actors, vaccine hesitancy, political rhetoric, and family communication. They draw from their experiences in various parts of the world, from Hong Kong and New Zealand to northern and southern United States. They demonstrate different mechanisms for graduate study support, from getting a fellowship from a program such as Fulbright to securing a scholarship from the university itself. Their diverse experiences notwithstanding, they are bound by our shared goal here at the Philippine Association for Communication and Media Research Incorporated to advance scholarship in our discipline for and about Filipinos and the Philippines. I invite you to take this opportunity to engage our resource persons today. Learn from both their research as well as their character, their embodiment of integrity as scholars, and their pursuit of excellence in scholarship. Learn how to make your graduate school application competitive, how to begin and complete your graduate studies, and how to conceptualize and implement papers which are competitive as well in reputable conferences and publications. As someone who completed my MA here and my PhD abroad as a Fulbright scholar, let me address urban legends that studying and doing research abroad is either easier or more difficult than pursuing the same here in the Philippines. Either option is presented with benefits and challenges, opportunities and threats. What matters ultimately is our personal motivation to take the first step and the final step in graduate school, to begin it, and more importantly, to finish it regardless of location. Thank you very much again for joining us today. And maraming salamat for our resource persons, Randy, Orville, Omar, Carlo, and Carl, for readily and generously accepting our invitation. Padayon sa ating lahat na scholar at mananaliksik ng bayan.
Thank you very much, Professor Hernan, for organizing this webinar together with the other board members of PACMRI. I believe they're also here with us this morning. I see Dr. Marge Acosta of Miriam College, Dr. Chen San Pascual of Comres, UP, Dr. Joyce Ariola of UST, Professor Naomi Bowak of the University of the Cordilleras, Dr. Mads Kiamco of Silliman University, and Dr. Divine Pasumbal of PUP. Thank you, Professor Hernan, for your welcome message. At this point, let me discuss some house rules, a few house rules. For this webinar, we shall first listen to all of the presentations of our featured scholars. They have each prepared a video recording of the presentation of their dissertation projects. We will play all of their presentations before we allot time for the open forum, where we can address questions regarding their research projects, but also about their experiences applying for their PhD programs and their experiences as scholars and students abroad. To pose a question or comment, please write your question or comment in the comment function of the Facebook broadcast. So I see a lot of people already messaging, people from Iligan. I think someone messaged from Maldives, from Catanduanes, Iloilo, Iligan. So I hope you are. I hope you will find this event meaningful and useful for your future endeavors. So we will also be issuing certificates of attendance to this webinar. We will give you more specific details about that at the end of this event. Okay, we shall now listen to our first speaker, Dr. Jose Carlo Depano, and his work on refocusing the lens of interpersonal persuasion research, message receiver related variables, and compliance resistance in various relational contexts. Jose Carlo Garcia Depano, PhD, congratulations, by the way, on the completion of your PhD degree, is an assistant professor at the UP Diliman Department of Speech, Communication, and Theater Arts. He is a Fulbright scholar and has recently completed his PhD studies at the University of Alabama. His other research interests include source credibility, persuasion, and interpersonal influence. Please welcome Dr. Carlo Depano. Let me just check if I will play the video. Will I be playing the video, Dr. Hernan?
Yes, you may play. I think we figured out the audio problem. Apologies, apologies everyone. Before we could mute, but now apparently we can no longer mute if we're also the host.
Okay, no problem. We'll play it from my end. Okay, let's give a virtual welcome to Dr. Depano.
Hi everyone, today I'm giving an overview of my dissertation titled Refocusing the Lens of Interpersonal Persuasion Research, Message Receiver Related Variables and Compliance Resistance in Various Relational Contexts. I think the first thing that I need to address is what exactly is compliance resistance and why is it important to study this phenomenon. In general, compliance resistance may be conceptualized as persuasion targets' unwillingness to act affirmatively on persuasion agents' requests or appeals. So the importance of compliance resistance emanates from the fact that it focuses on message receivers or persuasion targets. Because very often when we talk about persuasion, when we do persuasion or compliance research, we think of communication sources or persuasion agents. But we have to understand that an outcome of any persuasion attempt is not solely dependent on persuasion agents. In other words, regardless of how good they are, regardless of how effective their techniques may be, compliance resistance may still happen. Non-compliance may still occur. Hence, it is essential to understand or to examine the dynamics of compliance resistance so that we would know why message receivers say no, despite the fact that the persuasion agents, for example, are very effective. Now, compliance resistance is also often viewed as an expansion of compliance gaining research, and compliance gaining is very much related to persuasion. However, it has distinct features that separate it from the broader field of persuasion. One, it usually operates at the level of interpersonal communication. And two, it requires concrete actions. So mere attitude shifts or value transformations may not be considered compliance. So in my dissertation, I examined the connections of many variables, different variables, with compliance resistance. So from self-perceived credibility to relational closeness. If you would notice, I measured message receivers' self-perceived credibility instead of measuring source credibility. Why? Because again, when we talk about compliance resistance, we center on message receivers, not really on persuasion agents. So I was interested to know if the way people view themselves in terms of credibility could impact their response to a particular compliance attempt or to a particular compliance pursuit. I also examined intention to refuse compliance and perceived control over refusal to comply based on Adjusant's theory of planned behavior. And then I measured the impact of interpersonal relationship types or interpersonal relational contexts on non-compliance. But I didn't stop there because I thought if interpersonal relationship types could impact or could influence compliance resistance, then perhaps those factors
shaping these relationship types could also influence compliance resistance. And therefore, I examined interpersonal trust and relational closeness. So the figure there is I would call it a graphical representation of the research questions and hypotheses that I addressed in my dissertation. So you may just go over those research questions and hypotheses. I had 8 research questions and 4 hypotheses and 3 sub-hypotheses because of the multidimensional structure of credibility. I administered an online survey after receiving the approval of the Institutional Review Board, but prior to the full implementation, I did a preliminary test or a pilot test to address possible issues connected with the scales I used to measure the variables I mentioned earlier. I also checked the scales using different techniques: Mock and scale analysis, principal component analysis, Cronbach's alpha, and correlation analysis. I use principal component analysis for interpersonal trust because I thought, what if interpersonal trust had more than one dimension? True enough, after running a PCA, I found out that it had 2 dimensions. So I correlated each dimension with compliance resistance. I also use several techniques to analyze the gathered data. So qualitative content analysis, independent samples t-test, one-way analysis of variance, Pearson correlation test, and multiple regression to construct a model that could predict compliance resistance. I utilized non-parametric tests to check the results of the parametric procedures. Now, perhaps one question there is, why did you use non-parametric tests when people usually use parametric tests? Well, because the data were not normal. So the distribution was not normal, hence it violated one of the assumptions of most parametric tests. So I thought it would be best to use non-parametric tests just to verify the results of the parametric procedures. Actually, the results were pretty much the same, but I became more confident to interpret the results of the parametric tests because the non-parametric tests confirmed those results. Among the 3 demographic variables, only gender was found to have a significant impact on compliance resistance. Women had significantly higher compliance resistance than men. Since we don't have much time today, I could not possibly explain all the reasons behind that, but briefly, many scholars would argue that one possible explanation would be attention to details, socialization process, and so on. Again, I cannot enumerate all the possible reasons because we don't have much time, but you may always connect with me. You may send me an email message, and if you want to have a copy of my dissertation, I would be more than happy to send you my dissertation. All right, so 5 interpersonal relational contexts where acts of compliance resistance occurred were derived from the data set. So friendship, familial relationship, non-personal encounter, professional interaction, and romantic partnership. The context of friendship topped the list, presumably as a result of the high number of compliance attempts directed at friends. These compliance attempts could have been a product of the kind of intimacy shared by friends and the balanced relationship in friendship. So what exactly do I mean by the balance? What do I mean when I say balanced relationship and friendship? My point here is that this kind of connection is stronger than professional and non-personal affiliations. The refusal to comply creates some impact on people. In other words, friends could remember the times when they refused compliance because of this balanced relationship. If we compare this relationship with the kind of relationship we have with a co-worker, then this definitely is stronger. Because of that, we could remember non-compliance instances. But this connection is weaker compared with familial bonds or romantic partnerships. Therefore, we could not readily incorporate compliance resistance as part of our intimate relationships. All right, so my point here is Because of this balanced relationship, friends remember non-compliance experiences. Strangers don't remember non-compliance instances because they're just strangers. They don't know each other that much. Now, the next question would be, if that is the case, how come romantic partners, for instance, don't remember compliance resistance experiences? Well, they do, but perhaps perhaps non-compliance or refusal to comply is already part of the relationship, that it's no longer highlighted. And that perhaps was the main reason friendship topped the list. At first, I was expecting that familial relationship or romantic partnership would actually be the most dominant, but apparently it's friendship. The request typology developed from the data was composed of several categories. So request for company or presence, for action, requests associated with negative emotion, and so on. This is a very interesting finding because very often when we examine compliance, we focus on one particular context or we focus on two contexts. Say, for instance, request for material support. When we do experiments, we ask participants to give something or to buy something, or request for action to do something. Well, of course, these experimental studies would provide us much knowledge. It is interesting to note that the most dominant request type, at least in my dissertation, was request for company or presence, which is not very often examined in the literature. So what does it imply? It implies that we examine compliance gaining and compliance resistance or persuasion in general in contexts that perhaps, or in settings that perhaps are not very much apparent in real life or in real world. So next time we do, for example, studies on compliance, we might want to focus on request for company or presence because that was the most dominant, at least in this study. I should also mention that the patterns of request types based on interpersonal relational contexts were not very consistent. By inconsistent patterns, I mean, for example, requests for company or presence were also apparent in less intimate settings, professional interactions, for example, or non-personal encounters. So these findings suggest that relationship types were not a strong determinant of the kinds of requests that people make. So if that is the case, we may argue that perhaps instead of focusing on relationship types, we should center on the factors affecting relational ties. Right? So for instance, interpersonal trust, relational closeness, which I'm going to talk about in a while. 3 major and 5 minor categories of compliance resistance techniques were derived from the data. So the 3 major categories were refusal with another verbal message, refusal associated with emotion and or reason, and refusal with no other remark. So the first category was further broken down into more precise classifications. Refusal with a simple explanation, with a message of apology and gratitude, with an offer of future commitment, with a proposal of alternative, and with an ambiguous interaction description. Refusal with a simple explanation was highly employed across all the 5 relational settings. So why? Perhaps because I think this is interesting because even in non-personal encounters, refusal with a simple explanation was also highly employed. Again, why? Perhaps because, as Wilson claimed, compliance situations are face-threatening. And to address that, we feel the need to explain why we do not want to comply or why we refuse compliance. And this explanation is actually also applicable to other findings. For example, why do we have to apologize when we refuse compliance? Or why do we have to make an offer or to propose an alternative to save face? Okay, this is just one of the many possible explanations behind these findings. Again, we don't have much time, so I'm trying to just go over the important findings. There were significant positive correlations between the three dimensions of self-perceived credibility and compliance resistance. Therefore, credibility as a factor of persuasion may be attached not only to communication sources, but even to persuasion targets. So while credibility is often examined in relation to communication sources, in fact, we call it source credibility, traditionally, this dissertation or my dissertation would forward the idea that perhaps we should also examine how people view or how people assess their own credibility and how this assessment affects their response to a compliance attempt. And then responses to compliance attempts cannot be isolated from how message receivers evaluate their own credibility in relation to the credibility of both the presented message and the persuasion agent. Finally, compliance resistance is not a passive response to a compliance attempt or to a compliance pursuit. If we evaluate credibility, if we evaluate our own credibility and make that evaluation as one of our bases when we respond to a compliance attempt, it shows that compliance resistance is not a passive response. I mean, there is process behind it, therefore it is something active. There were also significant positive correlations between and among intention to refuse compliance, perceived control over refusal to comply, and compliance resistance. These findings confirm Atchison's claim that perceived behavioral control can influence both behavioral intention and the behavior itself. They also verify the usefulness of the theory in comprehending not only the act of compliance, but even resistance to it, because most of the time TPP is used to measure compliance. But this dissertation highlights the idea that it can also be used to understand compliance resistance, or the opposite, the conceptual opposite of compliance gaining. And finally, individuals can devise a plan despite the usually spontaneous nature of compliance gaining endeavors, because perceived behavioral control and intention and behavioral intention would signal the fact that we think about our decisions before we actually translate them into concrete actions. Regional contexts had no significant impact on compliance resistance. However, immediate interpersonal trust and relational closeness had significant correlations with compliance resistance. So in a nutshell, the factors shaping interpersonal relationships may be more powerful than relational labels. The point is how close you are. I mean, the measure of closeness may be more important than whether you are friends or romantic partners, right? The three exploratory variables also had significant relationships with compliance resistance, and four of the major variables, self-perceived competence, intention to refuse compliance, perceived control over refusal to comply, and immediate interpersonal trust, were significant predictors of compliance resistance. I think that is the most important finding here, because this model could account for about 37 to 38% of variance in compliance resistance. That means they could explain about 37 to 38% of the variance. So in the end, compliance resistance may serve as a persuasive message to convince the persuasion agent to act in accordance with the persuasion target's decision. So if we reverse the persuasive route, now we don't focus on persuasion agents, we focus on persuasion targets, we see the compliance resistance message as a persuasive message asking the persuasion agent to, hey, accept my decision, right? Accept my decision and let's move on. The relationships of the variables examined in the current study with compliance resistance show that the response to a compliance gaining message is not solely dependent on the factors associated with persuasion agents. And at the theoretical level, these findings imply that the frameworks that are utilized to examine compliance gaining may also be employed to understand compliance resistance. Lastly, at the practical level, these findings can be used to enhance the power of persuasion targets in compliance events. So again, I apologize that we didn't have much time, but you may send me an email message. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you and congratulations once again on your PhD journey, Dr. Carlo Depano. As we know, persuasion is a deliberate communicative practice, no, or behavior. And I'm sure a lot of us who would want to harness our persuasive skills were really interested in that presentation, no, and looking at the various influences and factors, to persuasion and compliance in general. Thank you very much again, Dr. Depano. We will now have Mr. Omar Dumdum and his presentation on news, negative pressures, and norms, news media as an international relations actor. Omar is from Cebu and currently a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, majoring in mass communication and double minoring in political science and global studies. His research articles are published or forthcoming in Mass Communication and Society, Political Communication, Global Perspectives, and an edited volume on democracy and security. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he was the coordinator for the Southeast Asian Research Group and will sit as a member of the university's International Student Advisory Board starting this summer. Prior to doctoral studies, Omar lectured at the De La Salle University and UP Diliman, where he received his master's degree in communication research. After years of public service at DSWD, Presidential Management Staff, and NEDA, he became a consultant for the Asian Development Bank. Currently, Omar is engaged as consultant for the World Bank, which commissioned him to write a paper on the role of public opinion on multilateralism. Please send your virtual welcome to Mr. Omar Dumdum.
Magandang araw o maayong adlaw. My current dissertation project comprises a series of studies broadly exploring the role of the press in international relations. I will present one study that I led together with Joe Lupito, who is now a faculty at UT Austin. In this study, we focus on how the press influenced the global norm of aid transparency among intergovernmental organizations, or IGOs. We spotlight how aid transparency reforms evolved within the World Bank, considered as a trailblazer in this area, and we identified two actors that aided this movement: the news media and epistemic communities. Aid transparency comprises not only public access of information, but also accountability mechanisms. Theoretically, IGOs want to remain less transparent. However, it is in their interest to be more transparent, as it helps them become more legitimate, improves service delivery, and addresses information asymmetries between the principals, such as aid beneficiaries and states, and IGOs as agents. Apart from principals, observers also make IGOs more legitimate and accountable. One such actor is the epistemic community, defined as a network of professionals with recognized expertise and competence in a particular domain. Its members include technical experts who are interested in policymaking and provide independent advice. Because IGOs sometimes lack expertise or have uncertainties on some issues, epistemic communities fill these gaps, thus contributing to transparency and certainty. The main difference with epistemic communities and the media is that the latter have an adversarial watchdog role against powerful institutions. We acknowledge that the press carries issue frames from various sources, but ultimately we are guided by the theory of presumed media influence, where people react not necessarily to media content per se, but to their perceptions of how the media affect others. So this implies that IGOs respond to pressures only when these are reported in the press, because of the media's perceived influence and reach to the public. We call this the public political route, where the news media are used to pressure other actors. On the other hand, epistemic communities use the organizational learning route in helping IGOs understand the importance of certain norms, such as aid transparency. These routes, however, are not purely one-way, since it is also plausible for IGOs, especially powerful ones like the World Bank, to be the source of global norms. So our goal was to trace the evolution of aid transparency policies within the World Bank to surface how these routes operate. Two general methods were used: qualitative archival research of bank documents to produce a causal narrative, then time series analysis showing which actor significantly influenced whom in these routes. The period scope is from 1975 up to 2010, or the year when the bank finally implemented its current access to information policy. We break down the evolution of aid transparency policies into two stages: involuntary resettlement and environmental reforms, and governance and anti-corruption reforms. Because of time constraints, I will only focus on selected events. In the first stage, the Philippines takes the spotlight with the Chico River Dam project in the 70s and 80s. The ambitious project was opposed by the Kalinga ethnic group who would be displaced from their ancestral lands. Protesters wrote letters directly to the bank, which was excessively defensive. It was only when they brought the issue to the international limelight through the press that the bank engaged with social scientists to craft resettlement policies. Later, these issues became closely tied with environmental reforms within the bank, as several high-profile projects in Brazil and India were also covered by the press. In India's Narmada projects, the bank formed an independent expert commission in 1991 that later blamed the bank and the Indian government for the project failures. The commission became the forerunner of the current inspection panel, the bank's main accountability mechanism. Aid accountability began to shift as a governance issue in the 1990s. Transparency International was established in 1993 by retired IGO bureaucrats frustrated by IGO's unwillingness to address corruption issues in aid-receiving states. By 1995, it launched its groundbreaking Corruption Perceptions Index, and the following year, the new World Bank president vowed to mainstream corruption issues in the bank. Another impetus was the rise of anti-globalization sentiments. The annual World Bank meetings became sites of demonstrations, as what happened in 2000, where 15,000 protesters were unlawfully arrested that spurred a class action lawsuit against Washington, D.C. In another case, Bank President Paul Wolfowitz resigned in 2007 over a highly publicized scandal that questioned his integrity in leading anti-corruption efforts. He was replaced by Bob Zelig, who continued with these reforms, leading to the passage of the Access to Information Policy in 2009. So in that short chronology, we identified examples where public, political, and organizational learning routes are at play. We then tested these more rigorously using time series analysis. Our strategy was to track the usage of aid transparency in bank documents, epistemic communities publications, and news media reports, then determine which time series data predict which pattern. To measure the bank's aid transparency discussion, we looked for documents containing the keyword transparent. This figure shows that from 0 documents in 1975, the number began to total in hundreds in 1989 and in thousands by 2003. By 2010, the number of transparency documents reached 1,629. For epistemic communities, we used Google Books Ngram, a big data set representing 6% of all printed materials ever. And we look for matches for aid transparency in the English corpora. The figure shows that from 0 in 1975, the number of matches slowly increased going into the 1990s, coinciding with the bank's governance reforms. You notice that there are 10 data points marked red. We identified them as having reliability issues upon review of the sources. So in our later analysis, we constructed an alternative time series through statistical imputation. So for lack of time, I will not delve into specific details, but rest assured that we took pains in resolving these issues. Finally, we proxy news coverage using the New York Times, considered as a newspaper of record and consistently cited in World Bank documents. This figure shows 3 time series representing 3 mechanisms of the public political route. First is news frequency, when the Times mentioned the bank regardless of issue or tone. Second is issue salience, when it relates the bank to the topic of transparency. And finally, negativity, when it portrays the bank adversely. While the Times has consistently published at least 100 World Bank stories annually since 1975, transparency-related news only started in 1987 and peaked in 2007, the year Wolfowitz resigned. From 1999 to 2007, there were more than a dozen negative news annually, with the highest in 2000 coinciding with the Washington protests. So from these 5 time series variables, we conducted Granger causality tests using 2 models, one with the original n-gram data and another with imputed data. Again, I will spare you the technical details, but instead show you an illustration of our findings. The first model shows a unidirectional impact of the Times negative news on both the World Bank and n-gram's discussion of transparency. Interestingly, transparency-related bank news temporally predicts negative news. In the second model, our imputations changed the dynamics a bit, yet it did not change the overall one-way influence of the Times bank coverage to the 2 actors. These quantitative analyses leave more room for improvement due to limitations from the n-grams data and reliance on keyword matches. Nonetheless, these issues were addressed by the qualitative causal narrative earlier, giving our study a more holistic view of policy norm socialization. So overall, this study highlighted the press's role in influencing international norms. We therefore urge political communication scholars to explore outside the realm of domestic politics and into international relations. Similarly, international relations scholars will find it productive to study the news media as a non-state actor. These further call for an interdisciplinary approach in studying media effects in international organizations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Omar, soon to be Dr. Omar Dumdum. We wish you well, no, and fingers crossed on the smooth completion of your dissertation's very interesting work on aid transparency. No, not quite a very popular, niche when it comes to communication research or research in general in the Philippines. No, we wish you well and hope to see you back in the Philippines soon. Our third speaker, Carl Patrick Mendoza, will now present his work on vaccine hesitancy and the cultural politics of trust in the Dengvaxia controversy, a critical realist case study of news content, producers, and audiences. Carl Patrick R. Mendoza is a PhD research candidate in media and communication at the University of Canterbury. He is a recipient of the UC Doctoral Scholarship for Students with Disabilities in 2019 and the Judith Answer Prize for students with a specific learning difficulty in 2021. His doctoral research project, funded by the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, seeks to understand how the news coverage of the Dengvaxia controversy reflected and shaped journalistic and parental trust cultures in Philippine society. We now give the virtual floor to Mr. Carl Patrick Mendoza.
Good day. My name is Carl Patrick Mendoza, and I am here today to introduce and present the findings of my ongoing study on vaccine hesitancy and the cultural politics of trust in the Dengvaxia controversy. Let me now move to the background of the study. So the Dengvaxia controversy is a public health controversy in the Philippines concerning the use of the Dengvaxia vaccine for dengue that was produced by the France-based vaccine maker Sanofi Pasteur. After reports circulated alleging that several children had died because of the vaccine, the Philippines Department of Health suspended the school-based vaccination program in late November 2017, Following this, the company stated that its vaccine posed a greater risk to people who have not yet contracted dengue. So, an important concept for this study is vaccine hesitancy. What is vaccine hesitancy? Vaccine hesitancy refers to the delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccination despite availability of vaccination services. Vaccine hesitant individuals are neither complete vaccine acceptors or refusers. Vaccine hesitant individuals are actually vaccine doubters who are quite uncertain whether they will accept or reject all or some vaccines, not just because they do not know enough about them, but also since they are driven by beliefs other than a belief in medical science. So this brings us to the issue of trust, because vaccine hesitant individuals are actually vaccine doubters. So when it comes to trust, the question is who or what is trusted by people in which context and for what beliefs or reasons. Now, the research problem of my study. So where risks continue to be the analytical focus of research, it will be impossible to accurately capture the complexity and context specificity of vaccine hesitancy because it views man solely as a rational, risk-perceiving actor. Reflecting the dominance of this rational choice lens on human behavior within the subfield of health communication, related studies on vaccine mass communication had strongly relied on social cognitive models that focus on media-induced changes to individual behavior at the expense of understanding the broader social contexts within which those who produce and consume vaccine messages are embedded. What remains to be known then, in the context of vaccine hesitancy, is just as how much do other mechanisms, apart from risk communication, influence or shape the vaccine cultures of entire groups or societies, and how such cultures are in turn reflective of the present structure of these collectivities. So the argument of this study is that the interpretive concept of trust has the potential to expand our understanding of vaccine hesitancy, as it highlights the non-calculative dimensions of the social order. For this reason, I chose culture rather than behavior as the locus of my theorizing on vaccine hesitancy and trust. One noticeable feature of the way I framed the research problem of the study is that it's actually dialectical in the sense that it tries to emphasize the balance between considerations about structure, about the external forces that shape human behavior, and a person's agency or a person's choice, so to speak. These are the main and sub-research questions of my study. So the main research question is, how did the overall news discourse of a vaccine controversy reflect and shape pre-existing trust cultures in Philippine society? I focus here on two trust cultures. One is journalistic trust cultures and the other one is parental trust cultures. So I'm not going to mention each of these sub-research questions because I am going to let you look at these questions in relation to the methods of my study. So the first research question focuses on the legitimization strategies. By legitimization, I simply mean the act of making social relations or certain aspect of social relations as acceptable and credible to an audience. The second research question focuses on journalistic trust cultures, that is how they reproduce or transform these legitimizations. Third is parental trust cultures, focusing on the vaccine hesitant parents and how they reproduce or transform such legitimizations that are present in the online news reports that I will be analyzing. So there will be a content analysis of news reports from Inquirer.net, Philstar.com, Manila Times, and Sunstar Philippines for the first research question. The second research question, I'm going to conduct semi-structured interviews with online journalists. For the third research question, I'm going to conduct focus group discussions with 4 vaccine-hesitant parent groups with 6 participants each. The last research question is primarily theoretical. So I haven't stated the exact data collection method and source for this question, as well as the variable of interest, because it relies on the answers which are produced by the previous 3 sub-research questions of the study. The preliminary findings of my study. So in a gist, my initial analysis found that Vaxia was largely represented as a discourse that is spoken about by powerful actors and as a discourse of being or having that describes the current state of affairs about the controversy as one which is largely political than scientific. So apart from being sayers, this set of actors were also represented as thinking, feeling, and perceiving agents in the controversy. Altogether, these representations work to the effect of naturalizing blame game as the default mode for discoursing on a health issue on the one hand, and objectivating legal institutional discourse as its primary medium of expression on the other. The journalists have mostly seen their roles as that of a fourth estate, so always trying to make the powerful accountable to the people by maintaining a healthy form of distrust on public officials and even experts, by hinging their trustworthiness evaluations to rough analysis of power and interest configurations in society. So the journalists do not simply quote just anyone. So they know that it's very important to take note of the interests and the powers behind those who speak about the controversy. So let's say a scientist or a public official said something about Vaxia. So they try to get behind the motives, the underlying motives of these people, so that they know which interests are they protecting, which interests do they want to advance. Because this is a very important consideration when it comes to a public controversy. Social actors who themselves are embedded in the political culture that ties morality and politics together, the journalists have a very real tendency to generalize their distrust of politics to all the institutions involved in the controversy when asked specifically about how the Vaxia affected their trust of these institutions. But this is tempered by their adherence to the journalistic practice of fact-checking and doing extra research. So here, my focus on the focus groups is the trust in information sources by the parents. So although both groups were demographically similar, their participants differed sharply about their trust on information sources about vaccines. The participants of the second group fitted the traditional mold of being hesitant, while their counterparts in the first group appeared to be more critical in their positions. This is because the first group appeared to be more independent and critical in their decision to delay or refuse vaccines for their children, as they have a more comprehensive set of information sources. Many of them questioned the mainstream media about its reportage of vaccine side effects and have actively browsed the web for alternative sources of information. The participants of the second group differ widely in terms of whom or where did they get information about vaccines. Some of them trusted their relatives, friends, colleagues, personal doctors more than they trusted media sources. But just like the participants of the first group, they also distrusted the mainstream media. Authenticity was an important concept that emerged in the two focus groups, given their shared distrust of mainstream media. A lot of parents insisted the importance of organic self-presentation as an indicator of trustworthiness. Parents note that part of the reason why they continue to trust personalities in social media who claim to be anti-establishment is because they appear to have a human face which they think is sorely lacking in the so-called experts who are often consulted by the mainstream media.
Thank you very much to Sir Carl Patrick Mendoza for that very interesting and quite timely research. No, I think it has also implications on issues that we are experiencing now, no, with the COVID vaccine. So maybe we can discuss that also further later on in your questions from the audience. So finally, we welcome now Dr. Orville Tacho and his work on post-truth in Philippine political rhetoric. Orville B. Tacho obtained his PhD in communication from the University of Alabama as Fulbright Shed Scholar in the United States from 2018 to 2021. He is also an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines, Baguio, and an alumnus of the Department of Communication Research at UP Diliman. His research interests include rhetoric, political discourse, and argumentation theory. His presentation is a preview of his recently completed dissertation. So let us all please welcome Dr. Orville Tacho.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and to the viewers watching at home. Thank you to the association and to my master's thesis advisor, Dr. Fernando Paragas, for extending an invitation. Thank you to our moderator, Dr. Randy Solis. So this is my topic for my dissertation, and just a tip, if you want to apply for Fulbright scholarship at the doctoral level, especially you'll be expected to come up with a research topic. And this is a topic that developed through the years. So the initial thoughts I had about it way back in 2017 or 2018 when I applied for Fulbright, I developed these initial thoughts into my dissertation 2 to 3 years later. So I'm looking at post-truth in Philippine political rhetoric. So I'm gonna present a bird's eye view of the dissertation. I cannot go into details. So let me just define a few terms. So first is post-truth. So to put it simply, so that you might understand it real quick, right? So mabigat kasi yan, may debate kasi sa term. So think of the words fake news, misinformation, disinformation, hoax, conspiracy theories, alternative facts. May literature bawat isang term. So I consider these terms as tactics in post-truth. So post-truth can be fake news, post-truth can be misinformation, post-truth can be disinformation. So like post-truth is the umbrella term for these tactics. But as with any dissertation, I'd have to operationalize what I mean by post-truth, and there I argue that it is a rhetorical strategy used to gain political advantage. So the inspiration for this definition is scholarship that says that post-truth is a deliberate strategy that undermines the theoretical framework for truth that's according to Pufachi. So sinisira niya kung ano ba ang notion ng truth. Ano ba ang facts, di ba? So today, you cannot just settle any question with that's a fact or that's not a fact because there are alternative facts, right? You can just say that's news, that's real news. Now there's fake news. So ang hirap masabi ngayon kasi even facts are subject to debate. Even facts are contested and even facts are disputable. Before you'll think facts will settle the questions, but now they don't, okay? Because of some conspiracy theories and misinformation. And this has implications for rhetoric and for communication, for our practice as well, as I will talk about later. The second term I need to define is rhetoric. So there are two ways to define this among classical and contemporary scholars of rhetoric. We have Aristotle, whom I quote here and whom I've drawn inspiration from in the research. Kasi si Plato, di ba, sinasabi niya, rhetoric is weaponized. Plato's not using that term, pero ang sinasabi niya, rhetoric, it's sophistry. It's something that we should not trust because it teaches people how to deceive and manipulate. But Aristotle says, no, rhetoric actually has a very important function in any democracy, or, well, particularly for Greek democracy, as it is as he defined it as all the available means of persuasion in a given situation. And for me, I simply define rhetoric as a form of content. It is a persuasive message. So pag sabi mong fake news, message yan di ba? Misinformation, nasa discourse yan, makikita mo, conspiracy theories and hoax. So for me, rhetoric is content. It is grounded in the message. So what I sought to investigate in my dissertation can be translated into 3 broad questions. So these are simplified versions of my research questions. How is post-truth embedded and encoded in the rhetoric of Duterte, Imelda Marcos, and the bloggers in Duterte's propaganda machine? What can we learn about post-truth in the context of the Philippines? And how can we combat post-truth? What are its correctives, or what are the solutions to post-truth, if you may? So to answer these questions, I actually advanced my own arguments. And these are actually part of the answers to those questions that I mentioned. I argued that post-truth is a rhetorical strategy that is mediated and mutually constitutive between political actors. So here, the operative word is relationship. It is rhetorically mediated because, as I mentioned earlier, post-truth can be found in fake news, in misinformation, disinformation. It is a form of message. So we cannot talk about post-truth without talking about rhetoric, right? Like the skillful use of words, oratory, or even deception when it is weaponized. So it is a relationship because there will be no post-truth political actor if there are no public, or there's no kind of publics or people who believe that political actor. Vice versa, right? So there will be no DDS without Duterte. There will be no Duterte without DDS. Do you agree or do you disagree? Do you think the DDS will just organically form without a personality behind it? That's hard to answer, right? Because the DDS draws its currency from Duterte's rhetoric. At the same time, Duterte's rhetoric is popular because of the DDS. Do you think there will be gaslighting by the Marcos family without the apologists? No. So you have to look at all sides of the equation. There will be no followers if there are no influencers. There will be no DDS without like Mocha Uson, RJ Nieto, and the echo chambers like Sasasot, giving currency or echoing the sentiments of the DDS. So here, rhetoric is used not only by elite political actors like Duterte, Imelda Marcos, or let's say Mocha Uson, RJ Nieto, and Sasasot, but also their followers. So misinformation, you can see that, or post-truth is used by the trolls, by keyboard warriors, by armies, okay? And there's research, it's proven that the government resources is spent on disinformation. So you have to look at all sides of the equation. Post-truth is a process embedded in populist politics. I'm not saying that only populists use post-truth. In fact, it can be used by anyone, even liberal progressive politicians. So disinformation is not really, no camp has monopoly over disinformation. But the point I'm establishing here is, if populist politics emphasizes demagoguery or an us versus them kind of division or polarization, right? Like Marcos blaming the Aquinos, Duterte always blaming the Aquinos. If you have that kind of division, you are more likely to use post-truth because you pin all the blame and all the faults against the others or the them, those who are not part of your camp. So you echo and you support those who are part of your political camp, but you're against the others or those who are in the opposing camps. And that's where the insidious purpose of post-truth comes in, because we don't look at like rationality or the good deeds of past administrations. We only blame them because we want to create an enemy out of them. There will be no DDS consolidation without a named, perceived, and visible enemy, and that enemy are the Aquinos, the elites, they say the Daang Matuwid liberals, etc., etc. I'm not saying that Daang Matuwid liberals, of course, has monopoly over righteousness, over like good use of rhetoric. They can also commit disinformation, and research has found that it's really rampant across political sides in the spectrum, right? But the point here is, if we emphasize divisions and polarization, like echo chambers and belief bubbles, we are not willing to afford moral or intellectual agency to those in the opposing camp. That's why even if they're telling you the truth, even if what they're saying is factual, we will not endorse what they're saying because they're not from our camp, because they're not one of us, because they are the enemy. And because, of course, what happened, look at red tagging today. Speaking truth to power, like journalists or lawyers, calling out government injustice, talking about government failures. What happens to them? They're killed because they do not support the administration, or because to the administration, what they're saying is sowing dissent, when in fact they're just telling the truth. I mean, to another citizen, they're speaking truth to power. The government, they're sowing dissent. That's treason. So what happens is they're killed. See, that's the insidious purpose of post-truth. Taken to its extreme, it can kill enemies, because enemies are not one of us. So finally, the final argument that I provided in the dissertation is that resisting post-truth requires going beyond questions of facts. As I mentioned earlier, even the facts themselves are disputable. So as I will mention later, my proposal is not just to look at news, media, or information literacy, but rhetorical literacy. And before I go to that, let me just provide some implications for my topic. These are three simple implications. First, I recommended looking at online and offline ethnographies. My method is textual analysis. More particularly, I employed Martin's rhetorical political analysis. So I looked at the rhetoric of Duterte in his war on drugs, the rhetoric of Imelda Marcos in the Kingmaker documentary film, the rhetoric of Mocha Uson, RJ Nieto, and Sasasot in their Facebook pages. So the next step for the dissertation, or for future studies for that matter, would be to look at how their supporters interact online and what their supporters have to say about the rhetoric of the elite political actors. So look at enclaves of DDS online. Look at the followers of the Facebook pages. Who are they? What activates them? What inspires them to participate in political discussions? Online incivility, right? So discussions of how bashing and trolling and how the keyboard warriors and troll armies online, there's a lot of research on covering that, but looking at their communicative aspects and their performative, even embodied aspects. Are these acts of rhetorical citizenship? What do they contribute to democracy? What are their implications for deliberation? That's the future step for the study. To look at rhetoric from below, I discussed this. To look at followers, not just the influencers, although the caveat here is it's hard to know who the follower and influencer in social media is, because sometimes even influencers are followers themselves, and even followers can become influencers, right? On Twitter, for example. It doesn't take so much effort for you to go viral these days. Just come up with, witty arguments or something that will align with the public's imagination, and boom, you might be an influencer one day. So you look at rhetoric in this porous and in the multi-dimensional way, like not caging actors as either just the follower or influencer, because they can be both. And finally, I recommend devoting studies on testing and theorizing solutions to post-truth, like looking at campaign finance reform, algorithms on Facebook. What can we do about them so that we can avoid misinformation? Is it a good idea to subject politicians to a digital death, like taking down their posts on Twitter or not giving them access at all? So we have to consider these things. Okay. So in conclusion, I argued that post-truth is here to stay. In fact, politicians and their campaign strategies will be more creative in the succeeding election. So we have to be more careful and cautious about the kind of rhetoric and how they use post-truth in more creative, refreshing, and subtle ways. Okay. So there's a difference between, hard sell and soft sell, or even you being persuaded without you knowing, manufacturing consent. Correct? So we have to look at all these things. Second, I recommend looking at rhetoric for the purpose of truth. It's not always weaponized. It's unfair that rhetoric is always blamed because it is looked at as the opposite of reality. But in fact, we cannot really talk about reality without the use of rhetoric. The words you use to describe reality, the speech you use to talk about truth, they all use rhetoric. Okay, so some scholars say everything is rhetorical, and that's true if what they mean is we use words to talk about reality, use words to describe reality. Words are essential to truth, right? So this time around, let's not look at rhetoric as something evil, but something that can aid us or something that can help us. Because it's unfair that when you look at Duterte or Trump, you say, oh, that's just rhetoric. He's not really saying something good. But it's also rhetoric that, for example, Martin Luther King used to inspire and mobilize the civil rights movement, right? So it's also rhetoric that Winston Churchill, Barack Obama used to propose change. So we have to look at rhetoric holistically, not just in its capacity to be used for evil, but also its potential for truth-telling. And finally, I recommended looking at rhetorical literacy beyond news, media, information literacy. And what I mean by this is it's not enough that we look at information, whether the information is correct or incorrect, right or wrong. Sometimes the disinformation in social media is based on opinions or arguments. So when it is based on an opinion, we have to look at the context. And when it is based on an argument, we have to look at who is affected by this argument. When you say, for example, that martial law is the golden era of Philippine politics and economy, you can verify that through fact-checking, through looking at economic data, statistics, and political events. But sometimes even these evidence or facts from history are dismissed, right? Like by Marcos apologists, because they argue, no, whatever you say, whatever the facts are, there are alternative facts. So what is needed here is not just to advance facts, and more facts, but to look at how their argument is constructed and who is affected by this argument, to conduct an audience analysis of who is persuaded by that kind of argument. Because when you know the audience that that kind of post-truth rhetoric targets, you'll be able to know how to massage a message to convince the audience. If you know the context of that argument, whether that information, for example, is correct or incorrect, if you know the context under which that information or that statement is made, that Marcos is the best president ever, if you know its context, where it's coming from, who it affects, then you'll be able to think of solutions about how to persuade people otherwise. So here, I would say rhetorical literacy through other means like using documentaries and other forms and functions of rhetoric that utilizes media, like advancing counter narratives, using documentaries, being intentional about the use of rhetoric, looking at rhetoric's capacity for disruption, but it is also normative nonetheless, as it aids in truth telling, and using rhetorical criticism, like what I mentioned earlier and what I conducted in the dissertation. I argued that these are all forms of rhetorical citizenship, and it is up to us, scholars of rhetoric and communication in general, to look at how we can combat post-truth in the years to come. Thank you for listening, and I'm very open to hearing your questions and your clarifications.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tacho, for theorizing post-truth, especially particularly in the context of the rather controversial political arena in the Philippines, in terms of the divide, the yellows and the reds, and so on and so forth. So I see a lot of comments from our viewers who got excited about the topic. So I hope we can explore more questions and discussions with our audience. And I hope that you start sending us your questions and your comments as we move on to the next part of our webinar. So yes, at this point, we are now opening the space for the Q&A, for the open forum. Again, for your question or comment, please type your question or comment in the comment function on the Facebook broadcast. So do we have questions now? Let's see. So may we also ask our speakers to turn on their camera so our participants, our viewers will see that you're actually with us this morning. So we have roughly around a little more than 30 minutes for the open forum, a good enough time for us to explore your studies, and hopefully also to get questions about your experiences, the behind the scenes. This is like the front stage of your dissertation and research projects, no? But we also would like to discuss like our experiences behind the scenes, no? So if we, okay, let's look at some questions. There's one question from Harleen May. And I think this can be addressed by perhaps all of our speakers. Now, the question goes, how can we take advantage of policy making in engaging communities when it comes to addressing rhetorical, information literacy, and issues on post-truth? So this is a question for Dr. Orville. No? There's really so much to do po, given the amount and reach of misinformation. So Dr. Orville?
Okay, thank you, Harleen, for your question. In fact, I agree with you. There's really so much to do in terms of the reach of misinformation. So yung pwede natin gawin, since you're talking about policy making, we can address post-truth as both a structural and an individual issue. So when I say structural issue, pwede natin tignan yung ano bang pwedeng gawin ng mga big tech, ng Facebook, for example, ng mga CEOs. Is deplatforming Trump or the post-truth actors enough? Or do we need policy making in terms of government or making it a more constitutional issue, right? Like, paano ba natin iiwasan ng disinformation but at the same time securing our freedom to speak, okay, or freedom of speech particularly. So, pwedeng maraming approaches dyan eh. So, yung ginawa ko sa dissertation is more of an individual or agency-based issue. Kasi as an educator sa communication, yun ang mas nasa sphere of influence natin eh. Di ba? We can't wait for big tech or for Mark Zuckerberg to do something about algorithms kasi kumikita sila with misinformation. So what we can do as teachers is how can we teach our students to discern right information from incorrect information? But more than that, maybe go beyond that, like not just what is right or wrong information, but how can we teach students context? How can we teach students argumentation theory so that they'll be able to say, or they'll be able to go beyond just facts and probably go to opinions and arguments per se. So again, yung sinasabi ko sa dissertation, we can approach it both on a structural level but also on individual level. I'm just in a better position to endorse individual approaches kasi yun ang sphere of influence ng teachers students, diba? But yung solution na yun is not really antithetical or hindi siya mutually exclusive sa pag-approach naman ng big tech or ng government dun sa issue on disinformation. So, yun, patuloy dapat i-theorize yung solutions. Like, ano bang ginagawa ng Facebook? Kunyari, labeling certain news items as potentially fake, deplatforming politicians, subjecting them to a digital death, lahat yan pwede nating tignan. As well as campaign finance reform, right? Anong pwede nating gawin sa during election 2022, ano pwedeng gawin ng COMELEC or Philippine government to address overspending and weaponizing social media. So lahat yan, all these solutions and approaches go hand in hand. So it's a big problem. It therefore requires a big solution. And you're right to say na malaki ang reach niya.
Thank you, Dr. Orville. Does anyone else want to address the question, want to answer? Maybe Dr. Depano on persuasion? Maybe some insights if we are stretching it.
Yeah, well, first I certainly agree with Orville, and I think Orville is the best person who could address that question. But considering my paper on compliance resistance, I think one issue here is most of the time when we talk about persuasion, when we analyze persuasive communication, we focus on the source of the message. But I think taking into consideration the definition and the conceptualization of compliance resistance, we must focus on persuasion targets or message receivers and the factors associated with them. For instance, if a persuasion agent fails to convince a person to buy something or to do something or to act on misinformation for that matter, we blame the persuasion agent and probably argue that the persuasion agent must use the following tactics or techniques. But we also have to understand that regardless of how good the persuasion agent may be, compliance resistance may still happen. Refusal to comply may still occur. And why? Perhaps because of the factors that are connected more with these persuasion targets than with persuasion.
Ayun. Thank you, Dr. Depano. So see, may parang pinapa-connect ko lang para we can hear all of you, no? In terms of maybe some questions are too specific, no? But might also relate to some of the other speakers' studies. No, I also saw here one comment about Carl Mendoza's presentation. Ludep Cladotorno said, this research is very timely, especially on our ongoing vaccination program. This is from Maria Lourdes Torno from New Era University. So maybe you can, did you find some implications from your current study on vaccine hesitancy in the COVID pandemic context?
Yeah, definitely COVID is something that I really cannot ignore, no, in terms of trying to find out the implications of Dengvaxia to the COVID vaccination program that we're doing now. But I guess there are certain things na mas malawak yung dynamics when we talk about COVID vaccination. First, it's still an ongoing program. It's still an ongoing thing. And at the same time, hindi lang kasi Philippine case yung tinitignan mo dito. You also look into the international dimensions of vaccine hesitancy. No? Kasi it could be that the issue is not vaccine hesitancy, but it could be vaccine complacency, or it could be a problem with regards to the vaccination rollout itself.
Right. So there are many other factors, no, to be considered because they are two different vaccines,
Yes.
no, altogether. So maybe that's something our commenter would like to pursue as her own research idea, no, moving forward. So sige, I think etong question has something to do more with yun nga yung sinasabi kong the backstage of dissertation work, no? And the question is from Gabriel Tongko. No, he asks, what would the panel's advice be for undergrads who want to pursue master's studies? Should they apply right after they graduate or get experience first? What are the pros and cons? Siguro let's hear from Omar first.
So personally, nag-work muna ako before I applied to Comres in UP Diliman. I worked for DSWD, and the experience that I got there actually gave me a lot of ideas, especially applying real-world situations, real-world problems into your research. So yun ang masasabi kong pro in na maghintay muna and getting some experience before graduate studies. But I guess there are, because I could just speak for myself, no? I guess there are also pros in terms of derecho to masters. I cannot speak for them, but probably the other panelists here can give their ideas on that.
Yes, who else wants to share their experience? Carl, please. Yes.
Yeah. In my case, actually, siguro yung taking masters immediately after graduating from college applies. Siguro one of the key advantages, no, of doing so is that when you just graduated, the things that you've studied in your undergraduate program are still fresh from memory. So, kumbaga, yung momentum mo is still there. And at the same time, siguro, if you are looking into applying for scholarships, can also provide you with a good opportunity to embark on a master's studies. Although we have practical considerations, no. We have different sets of priorities. Some of us need to help our respective families. Some of us still wanted to explore what's out there. So siguro in choosing whether or not to really do a master's immediately after graduating or whether or not one would desire to work first, I guess it depends on one's circumstances, really. There's really no one answer to that. Yeah.
Does Orville, thank you, Carl. Does Orville or Carlo have any response to that?
Yeah, medyo ililihis ko lang ng konti yung response ko. I think apart from considering whether you would pursue graduate studies right after doing undergrad, apart from that, siguro importante rin yung I don't know how to phrase this better, but maybe emotional maturity or emotional stability, because I think masters and PhD, um, hindi lang yung intellect, hindi lang yung intellectual capacity ang challenge niya. They also challenge your emotional maturity, kung gaano ka, because I think there are days that you just want to drop everything, give up, go home, and maybe abandon PhD. And then you ask yourself, why am I doing this to begin with? But I think if you have that good level of emotional maturity or emotional stability, then it would be a bit easier for you. So if you find that right after undergrad, then maybe that's a better option for you. But if you find that after maybe a couple of years working in a company or working in the academe, then baka kailangan mag-spend ka muna ng 1 to 2 years and then you do your master's or your PhD.
Thank you, Carlo. How about Orville?
So agree ako sa lahat ng nasabi nila Sir Carlo and Sir Omar and Carl. Siguro ang madadagdag ko na lang, consider if you want the master's degree for a job in the academe or in the industry. Kasi marami minsan nagma-masters, akala nila magagamit nila yon sa practice nila or sa industry. Pero yung depende sa program, baka mas pang-academe yung track kapag nag-masters ka or PhD. So maybe soul searching or yung sinasabi nga ni Carlo na emotional maturity, find out kung ano ba talaga muna yung gusto mo. If you want to pursue a career in the academe, find a program that will hone that scholarly skills, di ba? Pag naman gusto mo sa industry, meron mga programs na pang practitioner. So siguro yun lang yung practical advice na ma-add ko.
Okay, can I add? I really agree with Carlos. Sabi niya yung emotional maturity. You would know that graduate studies is such a solitary journey. Parang ikaw lang mag-isa. So that's why you need to really have, aside from friends, you really need to have that emotional support, that for example, mga colleagues mo to do collaborative work. You really need to do that. So agree ako kay Carlo na you really need to have that emotional maturity. I don't know how you would gauge that, but malalaman mo na okay, I'm okay. And also to Orville's take, tama din yon. But so galing ako ng government, you really need to have a master's degree kung gusto mong maging division chief. So that's also one of my goals. So parang okay, I will go up the ladder. Pero tinitingnan mo yung different levels in government. Lalo na yung Officer 5 level, you really need a master's degree dyan. So yun, kailangan din yan sa industry. I could just speak for, again, my experience in the public sector. But yeah, in the industry as well, in private sector, kailangan din yung graduate degree to some extent.
So these are all like philosophical discussions din, no? Like emotional maturity and all. But some universities provide filters for that, no? Some universities would say you cannot be admitted unless you have 1 year or 2 years experience. So I think the filter is there so that they can ascertain that someone is really in for the right reasons, going into the program for the right reasons, and also maybe for them to, bring something to the table, like their experiences, and a lot of the classes kasi also rely on, wisdom from the industry, for example, that you can theorize on. So theorizing experiences. So some universities provide that filter. So maybe for people like Gabriel, you also have to look at the universities you are considering, and maybe they have those criteria, before you can actually apply. Sige, balik tayo sa research questions, no? We have here a question from John. Cute name, no? John Satabe. His question is, I think this is for Orville again, no? And anyone else can also answer, no? Baka some of your past researches would also be able to address this question. What are the challenges or profit in analyzing the rhetoric of Mr. Duterte when his pronouncements are oftentimes contradictory? One strong statement today might be announced as a joke tomorrow. So I think this has something to do with the West Philippine Sea rhetoric, no? And his volatile rhetorical motives interpreted for us by his allies and spokesperson. I think a very practical question, no?
Yes, John, in fact, that's a very astute observation. You're right. Your question is post-truth. 'Di ba? Kasi yan yung isa sa mga indicators at saka masasabi mong mga manifestations ng post-truth. Yung may mga spokespersons ka na binibigyan ng context yung sinasabi mo. Your joke, your serious statement during the campaign is made as a joke today. So, I'll talk about the profit first. Siguro yung profit dito is you'll feel na by analyzing Duterte's rhetoric, you'll be able to suggest solutions. And by suggesting solutions, you can hopefully influence the deliberations even in online spaces, or even recommend like better ways of doing rhetoric. So to me, that is in itself, it's profit. So kikita ka ba or other profits or mga external rewards, I'm not sure. But siguro yon parang consider it as an act of citizenship, right? So you're part of a democracy. So how might you as well recommend productive ways of engaging rhetoric? What are the challenges? Well, the first challenge I would say is you have to look at Duterte's rhetoric not in a vacuum but in context. So ang statement niya is hindi lang made during the historical moment or like the circumstances of today. You have to look at it like a series of time or may timeline yan, di ba? So paano nag-evolve yung statement? Or ano yung mga statement niya before that compounds and contributes to how we understand him today? So that's the first challenge, di ba? To look at Duterte's statement not in a vacuum, but to look at it like in its entirety. So how did I address that in the dissertation? I think there's a benefit na nakita naman natin. We should take Duterte's statements with a grain of salt. At least we see that now, and we're sure about it now. I mean, who will take Duterte seriously today? Diba? So maganda yung titignan mo yung mga presidents eh. So alam mo na yung pattern ni Duterte. So ngayon, meron ka ng lens under which to examine his rhetoric. And for me, I'm just fortunate enough na he had this series of post-truth statements. So therefore, the appropriate perspective under which I can examine his statement is from the lens of post-truth. Kasi may evidence ka na eh, di ba? So it's not as if sinasabi ko lang, I feel ko lang, ang impression ko is gumagamit si Duterte ngayon ng post-truth. Meron ka ng pattern from history, from his previous speeches. So dahil meron ka na niyan, masasabi mo na, okay, this is probably an appropriate lens under which to view his strategy. So that's one challenge. What are the other challenges? Of course, you'd always have to ground your arguments sa evidence. Kasi sa rhetorical analysis, it sometimes is a very misunderstood methodology because it's not like the social scientific methodologies of survey, content analysis, or even focus group and interview. So meron kasing strand ng textual analysis na mas humanities, di ba? Mas humanistic. So parang ang pinaka-challenge mo dyan minsan is how do you make sure that your interpretations, of course, are plausible. So here, you're not saying your interpretations are the absolute truth. I'm not saying my interpretations is the only way to understand Duterte's rhetoric, but at least you should be able to ground it in evidence, like anong mga statement, close reading. So technically, yung textual analysis, rhetorical political analysis would require close reading. So paano mo iba-back up na yung interpretation mo of Duterte's statement is plausible, if not even true, but is even plausible, di ba? So titinan mo yung mga statements niya, magbigay ka ng evidence, actual, yung verbatim vocabulary ni Duterte, provide the social context to the statement, di ba? So any reasonable person naman would see if you're overreading, di ba? So medyo may ganon na ina-avoid, medyo dina-juggle mo yan eh. Paano mo masasabi na you're saying something but at the same time you're not overreading? But then again, is there such thing as overreading in textual analysis, di ba? So usually, pagka sinasabing overreading, you always ground it in the evidence. Data ang tawag dyan sa social scientific research, but evidence yan pagdating sa speeches. So, yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Sige, itatapon ko na rin yung isa pang question kay Orville kasi related na sa discussion mo about textual analysis. I think this has something to do with you being the last speaker, so napaka-fresh pa ng mga ano. But there's one question here from Karen Varona. No, I think you know each other, no? She says, thanks to all the speakers for an interesting discussion. For Dr. Tacho, please elaborate on your methodology. So you were talking about textual analysis earlier, especially the indicators for rhetorical strategies and rhetorical literacy. Tapos may question siya for all speakers which I will throw in later na, no, after Orville's ano. And if anyone else wants to address the joke as rhetoric, no, later on. Sige, Dr. Orville.
Okay, siguro Karen, medyo nasagot ko na yung part ng question mo dun sa response ko kay John. So dadagdagan ko na lang, okay? So I want to give the other speakers as well time to answer kasi marami rin tayong insights na maririnig from them. Indicators, you're talking about indicators for rhetoricals. Always babalik tayo sa literature. So in my presentation, meron akong binigay na words like fake news, misinformation, disinformation, what else? Conspiracy theory, hoax. So lahat yan ay indicators ng post-truth at lahat yan nakuha ko sa literature. Merong sense doon na mafe-feel, kasi intuitive yan eh, di ba masasabi mo na, how can you talk about post-truth without talking about fake news? So sometimes makikita mo na, related yung dalawa, but always I go back to the literature to find those indicators. But in rhetorical strategies, we're not as strict with indicators per se eh, na yung tipong, kasi hindi naman natin siya mini-measure eh, di ba, hindi ko naman siya try na ipa-survey or di ba i-content analyze. So, but nonetheless, meron pa rin tayong consider na indicators sa textual analysis na yun nga grounded sa literature. So, how do I make sure na yun talaga ay mga indicators nila? Usually, you look at the citations of the authors themselves. So usually, one author talking about fake news differentiates fake news from conspiracy theory. And one author talking about conspiracy theory differentiates it from hoax. So titingnan mo, ano yung relationship ng tatlong yun? At the same time, ano yung difference? Kasi dun sa variable na inaaral mo, like for me, post-truth, pwedeng may nuances yung mga terms na yun, pero pwede ring related sila. So always going back to the literature, that's usually the best bet to come up with like a methodologically grounded and even empirically grounded framework.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Orville. Does anyone else want to answer? I know Omar also did some studies on source credibility before, no? And Carl is of course working on persuasion. Let's go back to the question of John, no? Parang what are the challenges in doing rhetorical analysis on the pronouncements of the president, no? Considering that most of them are contradictory or are loosely interpreted by his allies. So do you want to share something about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I almost forgot that I did source credibility research before, but my answer would be related to what I presented earlier. I did historical analysis. So I read a lot of archives. I read a lot, and these sources are contradicting. Sometimes, babasahin ko yung source ng World Bank, sabi nila ganito, ganito, ganito. Binasa ko yung source ng Kalinga Group in Chico River Dam. Iba yung sinabi nila. So may tension, di ba? So isa yan sa, and then you would at least in the historical analysis part, titingnan mo like sino ba talaga ang tama ang sinabi. Parang sometimes you can't like dates. Sabi nila 1978 pero hindi, 1976 ang sinabi dito. Parang at least you have to have a lot of bases covered on the ground para masasabi mo na okay, ito yung tama. So I think related with Orville kasi ang history could be a humanities field, it could be a social science field, it could be very cultural. So may rhetoric din dyan, right? When I read speeches ng World Bank president, kailangan ko siyang i-ground like ano ba ang konteksto nito? Okay, may protesta pala sa labas. Kaya niya ito nasabi. Like for example, may isang World Bank president sabi na okay, we will now fight corruption, but well sinabi lang niya to dahil naglabas ng report ang media before. So parang may context na ganyan. It's really hard actually. Even I mean Orville is doing rhetoric, but I'm also doing historical analysis, which is nandiyan na nga siya, di ba? Parang data na nga siya. Parang ang hirap pa siyang i-analyze further. But yeah, I think you just have to cover all your grounds for all of it na masabi mo na okay, tama ito or what. I think Carlo could also add something kasi related yung sinabi niya.
Yeah. Yeah, I also did a paper on source credibility. But this time for my dissertation, what I did was message receivers' self-perceived credibility. So I kind of like shifted the focus. Siguro in terms of indicators, mas magiging methodological yung sagot ko. Kasi hindi ako masyado sa rhetoric, mas post-positivist yung approach ko. Pero dun sa question na, for example, how do you measure indicators? Or how do you know that you're actually measuring this particular variable? Siguro kung sa quantitative side, we have a number of statistical treatments that we can use to see that we measure the variable, because most of the time we can't really measure na straightforward yung isang variable. May mga dimensions, and then you do dimension reduction, item reduction para makuha mo talaga yung variable na yan. So marami namang available instruments for that. Ako, for example, I use mock and scale analysis para dun sa item reduction, apart from the more traditional ones like Cronbach's alpha, etc. Pero in terms of methodology, I think kung yung indicators yung tinatanong pa, paano ba naman measure yung indicators na yun, quantitatively there are so many ways to actually determine those variables, or to determine if you are measuring those variables accurately, at least from statistical standpoint. For example, yung source credibility, kapag ka nag-survey ka ng literature, iba-iba rin yung sinasabi nilang dimensions. From Berlo to McCroskey to, kung babalik ka kay Aristotle, iba-iba yung dimensions na sinasabi nila. Pero I think yung one crucial factor doon ano ba yung inclination ng researcher doon sa yung theoretical inclination. For example, in my case, I always use McCroskey's measure. So yung dimensions of source credibility lagi kay McCroskey naka-anchor. But if you use Berlo, if you use other scholars, then iba din yung sasabihin nila sa'yo na dimensions. So hence, iba rin yung indicators.
Sige. Let's go back to Karen's question. I think this is also very useful for our viewers. No, yung question niya is, please share your time and stress management strategies. A very practical question, but less discussed, no, in webinars like this. Who would like to go first? Sige, Carlo, please.
Okay, I'll go first. Kasi tinansya ko muna kung may unang magsasalita, pero parang wala pa. So, siguro it's accurate to say that I gained so much weight mula na nag-start ako mag-PhD. Kaya rin yung pinadala kong picture, 2015 photo yun Kasi parang I look best there. So, needless to say, yung isang stress management technique ay eating, lalo na during the pandemic kasi wala ka naman masyadong magawa. And then, siguro in our case, sa case namin ni Orville, usually we allot like certain days na walang gagawin talaga. Yung i-drop mo lang lahat and then just do whatever makes you happy. Yung hindi pa pwede na parang all your life dun sa PhD ay yun na lang PhD dissertation mo or yung topic mo na lang yung isip mo. Kailangan umalis ka rin dun once in a while. Yeah.
Who else wants to share their strategies? Carl, please.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I simply go out and see nature. That's my way of distressing and my way of relaxing. Lalo na siguro yun, no, babanggitin ko na rin. One of the perks of doing a PhD abroad is that you're able to get to nice and beautiful places outside the country. So why not maximize the chance of actually going out, safely going out during this pandemic, and breathe fresh air and try to forget your thesis at least for a time.
Lalo na siguro sa New Zealand, Carl, no? Where it's like lands and landscapes and beautiful campuses also. Sige. Can we hear from Orville or Omar?
Yeah, siguro ako nanonood lang ng Netflix, pero parang minsan nakaka-stress yun kasi nire-rhetorical analysis ko din yung pinapanood ko. So hindi ko din nakakalimutan hindi ko rin nakakalimutan yung mga stress academic. Pero no, kidding aside, really find your most productive time of the day to work. Kasi parang it's been like for me a habit na hindi ko kasi magagawa yung isang big project ng overnight or ng like 2 weeks. Ganun. So parang little steps every day. So siguro ako ang pinaka-productive ko 1 to 3 p.m. Or 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. every day. So there I work. And then before that or after that, medyo naglalata ako ng time for other things. So siguro yun lang.
Omar?
I think we have like a few Filipino PhD students here in UW-Madison. So we have like a very tight-knit group. So parang nasa Facebook Messenger kami. So ganyan. And then, so yung pre-pandemic, Friday nights, we always play mahjong. So yan ang distressor namin. So konti lang kami dito na PhD students, but we know each other here from different fields. May taga-engineering, may taga music. So yun. And also, if all else fails, like deadline is nearing, you can just always ask for extension. Like, ask the professor, like, could I be given an extension kasi parang hindi ko na kaya. So yun, I think yun ang mga major stress management techniques ko here. And ask also help if hindi na kaya mentally. It's such a taboo to ask for mental counseling, mental therapy. I mean, in the Philippines, no? Pero dito, we are trying, at least in the US, at least in our campus, talagang in-encourage kami to seek help pag you're having anxiety attacks or mga pa-break ka na sa yung mental health. So yeah, don't always hesitate to ask for help. Maski anong klaseng help yan. So yun.
So social networking is also important, no? Like I think si Omar, you said you were a coordinator of the Southeast Asia research group.
Yes.
Or something. So maybe those groups can help.
Yeah, so so it's a graduate student na organization na graduate students studying Southeast Asia from across different fields. So yun, networking din, syempre may inuman or something, but part na yan ng networking, di ba? So yun, part of your social support din here.
Right. Sige, there's one question here na considering the COVID pandemic context, no, and doing research. Earl Jed Roque asks, what are the strengths, challenges, and limitations of online ethnography as a research method, especially when studying the Philippine setting while abroad? Or parang doing online data gathering, perhaps. Not necessarily ethnography, but if you're doing ethnography, then maybe you can share something about that. Carl, you want to share?
Well, I'm not doing ethnography per se, but I guess given the nature of my data collection methods, I'm currently conducting online interviews and online focus groups. I guess in challenges is the same when you do online ethnography. Practical limitations due to internet connectivity, in yung mga most obvious ones. Yung siguro, you will be forced to limit your population to the ones who are actually connected online. Of course, minus mo na agad dyan yung mga walang access sa internet. Pero I guess when it comes to online ethnography, marami na ring discussions about the changing nature of the field. So yung field natin is not just the physical field anymore. So some scholars actually justify and in fact try to argue that doing online ethnography comes with the benefit of exploring the unexplored spaces of cyberspace. No, Yun lang.
Anyone else wants to share? Sige, Omar.
Not really ethnography per se, but I have one study where I need to interview a lot of key informants. And it's just so practical now to do it online. Dati, di ba, parang over Skype, parang hindi pa siya masyadong yung, like, it's a popular or it's yung ginagamit siya na method of interview, right? Pero ngayon, ang study namin is about documentary films. So while I was here, I was able to interview a lot of documentary filmmakers back home in the Philippines. Sila Alice Arumpak, yung director ng Aswang. So sila, na-interview ko sila lahat in a span of like 4 days, like five directors in 4 days, and you can't do that physically, right? Like pupunta ka, I mean, magbubus ka, pupunta ka to QC, babalik ka na naman to Makati, to ito, di ba? But now it's parang it's normal. It's normal to do your interviews over Zoom na. So yun ang strength ng ng online ng nagawa ng pandemya ngayon with online research.
Siguro if I may share, no, I also did, like, while I was in Hong Kong, I did a study on Filipino gay men cruising. No, so what I did was to do email exchange, no, with some of my informants. No, so I felt it was the appropriateness is still key in terms of determining if you really need to do it online or digitally. But because I was in Hong Kong and I was doing a study of Filipinos in the Philippines, so it was necessary. But also because my approach was life history, no? So parang I wanted them to look at the when they started cruising and everything, no, historically. So parang it was like writing a diary for me. So writing through email, I felt became appropriate because it was more introspective and it allowed them the freedom and the time to reflect and to write their experiences, no? And I also did like research on transnational families. That's my dissertation, no? Left behind children in the Philippines and migrant parents in Hong Kong. So a part of my data gathering was digital ethnography. I followed my migrant parents and their children online through their social media and looked at how they, sustain transnational familyhood through social media. So of course, ethical considerations must be observed. No? So informed consent, privacy, anonymity. So these are also issues in digital ethnography. So when you harvest some responses online, you have to anonymize them, you have to paraphrase them, so they cannot be traced back to the people who said what online. No? So these are considerations when doing digital online ethnography or research in general. Sige, we're almost done, no? But let me just sorry if we could not entertain all of the questions and we have just 2 minutes left, no? But a lot of the comments are really thanking the speakers for the very informative presentations that they have. So they said they learned a lot, they were enlightened, and nakakaengganyo, nakaka-inspire yung inyong mga research presentations, no? So thank you very much for all of your questions and comments and for the hearty discussion. I hope that, aside from being inspired by the research presentations of our speakers, you also had a glimpse of how it is, doing your PhD or maybe your MA or graduate studies, so that others too may be inspired in their own research journeys, in scholarship and graduate studies. So before we go online, let me just check from ayun. Okay, so wrap up na. Okay, yeah, because it's around anong oras na? 11:29. So but before we go online, we would love to hear from you, our audience, our viewers, on Facebook, regarding your experience with us this morning. Please answer the evaluation form, and the link is there. It's flashed, and maybe someone can just copy and paste it onto the Facebook chat room, the Facebook comments, so that they can easily cut and paste it for access. Please answer the evaluation form because certificates will be issued to participants who pre-registered before this webinar who also left a comment or reaction in the event page in Facebook, no, and those who completed the evaluation form. No. The form, for you to be able to get your certificates, the form must be submitted by 11:59 tonight, no, May 12, 2021. We would also like to invite academics, scholars, students, and teachers who would like to join the Philippine Association for Communication and Media Research Incorporated, or PACMRI. Please take note of the dates, the schedule there posted, and the links for the application forms and information. You may also access this announcement and information at our Facebook group. That's facebook.com/PACMRI. So please join us. No? Also, I'm happy to announce, no, that the Department of Communication Research of UP Diliman College of Mass Communication is gearing up and starting, no, and preparing for the launch, no, of our National Communication Research Conference 2021. No, that will be set for November 12 to 13. Let me just look at yung ating topic, no, and call for papers. If I may also post it here. Yan. Okay. This is our, okay, cannot screen share, but okay, the theme for the 2021, this is our 7th NCRC, no? The theme is breaking through outbreaks and breakdowns, researching communication and media in the pandemic. So we will be sending out the call for abstracts soon, no? So, but we will be entertaining both student papers and faculty papers, no? So there will also be competitions for both categories. So this will be for November 12 to 13. So I hope we will be getting submissions from you, and hopefully also your participation in the conference in November 12 to 13. So don't forget, save the date, November 12 to 13, NCRC, National Communication Research Conference. Okay, so again, we show you the slide for the evaluation for the webinar this morning. Again, we thank all of our speakers, Orville, Omar, Carlo, and Carl, no, for giving us this time, 2 hours of very hearty discussions and inspiration to our future graduate students also in our viewership. No? So we thank all of you and also our audience for coming, and see you again in the next PAC MRI webinar. Good morning. Bye.